Now entering Nerdist.com.
Mission Log Supplemental, number 7. The one with David Gerrold.
I'm recording.
I am also recording. You know what this makes me think we should do, John?
What should we do?
Maybe a supplemental episode of Mission Log, a Roddenberry Star Trek podcast. What do you think?
Well, you know, Ken, it's so strange that you and I would both be connected via computer at the same time and recording at the same time. So, yeah, why not? Why not turn this into a supplemental? And I would say not just any supplemental episode, Ken Ray. I would say this will be the supplemental with David Gerrold, he of Tribbles fame.
It will be supplemental number 7, if you are keeping score at home. We do have a conversation, really, I think a fascinating conversation with David Gerrold, the inventor of the Tribble and the troubles that did ensue, coming up in just a bit. We do also have a bit of interesting listener feedback, but first, say it with me, John, Vegas, baby.
Vegas, baby. Yeah, all right.
Maybe we should have rehearsed that, but you know.
For any of our listeners who may not know, and I hope that's just a small minority of you, the big, gigantic, mega convention to end all Star Trek conventions will be in Vegas again the second weekend of August at the fabulous Rio Hotel. And Ken, you and I will be there representing Mission Log. And I'm very excited about that because the last time we were in Vegas together, we had just launched Mission Log, and we really didn't have anything to do.
Yeah,
you know?
Mission Log actually, well, I found stuff to do.
You found things to do.
Yeah. I think actually Mission Log launched the first day of last year's convention. Mm-hmm. And that was kind of exciting because we woke up and there was no show, and then all of a sudden we were near the top of iTunes, which was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
So we're passing out cards and we're saying, no, really, we do a show about that. Well, one so far, but seriously, we're going to do every episode of Star Trek. And now by the time we get there, it'll be 50-something. Episodes of Star Trek, one a week, and long may we wave. So and stop by and see us because we will wave and do other things. Stop by will be which do you want to do first, the small one or the big one, and which one do you consider small?
Well, I consider small the fact that we will be no. I reverse my decision.
You really can't do it, can you?
No, I can't do it. Okay, here's the little thing to be aware of. This little thing
I would not even say little. I would say, do you want to do the big one or the big one?
We're going to do the big one first. The big one is the panel.
And then we'll do the big one, which is the Roddenberry booth.
Right.
Okay, do the panel.
Okay, so the panel, Ken and I will be doing Mission Log Live, where we will be on a panel, on a stage. It looks like the inimitable Larry Nemeczek will be hosting that panel, and we will talk about Mission Log. We'll talk to Larry. We will get listener Q&A, and I do think that will turn into a supplemental episode of its own. So if you want to ask us questions, then that will be the time to do it because it'll be on stage. Everybody will be there. I'm really looking forward to that. But as big as that is, Ken, I think the other thing may be bigger. What is that other thing?
Well, I mean, it's certainly a large table.
Right, it's a huge table.
Yeah.
Smack dab in the middle of the vendor room.
So Roddenberry, I guess it's Roddenberry Entertainment, right? Mm-hmm. In the middle of the vendor room has a gigantic presence where they, sell shirts and they sell other things, and, they hang out and they're just, generally speaking, groovy with people. And so we're going to hang out there and be groovy with people, just like you, unless you're there, in which case with you.
Yeah.
Yeah, we don't have an exact schedule for that, but, I know I'm planning on sleeping under the table, so I will be there, pretty much the whole weekend, maybe awake part of the time. Other times it could be like that Tilda Swinton thing, just stop by and watch me sleep.
Yeah. Oh, what a good idea that is.
That really sounds ghastly.
But we'll be hanging out. We'll be chatting. We may even do some recording at the table and turn that into something. We don't know. I mean, It's a whole weekend that we get to make up the rules.
Yeah, but the best part is, I mean, there have been a number of people who have said, I hope we bump into you in Vegas. I hope we get to see you there. I know there have been people that I've said that to as well. So we're going to, at least for part of each day, going to be a fixed point to which people can come. And probably the Twitter handle Mission Log Pod would be the best way to find out. Well, one of us will actually have to run out of the hotel and tweet
Right.
that we're going to be there, because if you haven't been to Rio, bring your cell phone, because you may leave the hotel, but otherwise it's just a clock the whole time you're there because there's no connectivity.
Right. The important pieces of business to express to you all, as Ken mentioned, Mission Log Pod on Twitter and also on Facebook, Mission Log Pod. We will mention where we will be and at what time. So stay tuned for all of those details to come in. Also, we want to mention that the website for the convention, creationent.com, is where you can get all the information about Star Trek Las Vegas, August 8th through the 12th, 2013. And I also want to mention, we will probably have some Mission Log t-shirts, some swag, as it were, Ken. And you can find all of that not only through missionlogpodcast.com, but through missionlog.spreadshirt.com. And we have some cool new designs there for everybody to check out. So if you come and you're wearing a Mission Log t-shirt, well, you will win our praise and adoration.
Yeah, that's it.
That's what you get from us.
There are no prizes. Sounds like maybe we should try to, here's what we'll do. You create a distraction. I'll grab something from another table.
Yeah. like a Tribble from David Gerrold's table.
Yeah, maybe a Tribble from David Gerrold's table. I know Garrett has some lovely T-shirts.
He does.
And, you maybe, yell, my hair's on fire.
Right.
Garrett will look at you, and I'll try to size up whoever we're getting the prize for and grab you a snazzy Garrett Wong T-shirt.
We come up with so many good ideas just on the fly. This is totally improvised. People.
Yeah, you would never know that, would you?
Never know.
You would never, ever, ever guess that.
All right. Well, enough of our yammering. Let's get on to the David Gerrold interview. So, David, can you walk us through your original Star Trek fandom and kind of what led you to submit your story ideas? What attracted you to the show in the first place? What made it different?
Well, I did write a book called The Trouble with Tribbles, the making of et cetera, which outlines this. So it's kind of like, oh, God, do I have to talk about this again? Basically, I was in my last year of college. They were going to what's the word I'm looking for? They what they call senior students is like, okay, we've had enough of you. We're going to move. You're graduating. I don't want to graduate. I'm happy in school. No, you're graduating. I'm not dead yet. I'm not. And get on the wagon. So I had been cast in a show called Winnie the Pooh. I was playing Rabbit, and children's theater. And what happened was they a Thursday night, 8:30, NBC premiered this weird new show. I hadn't seen any. I'd only seen one preview of it on NBC. I mean, there was no real publicity. But I said, oh, Star Trek. Oh, God, it'll probably be another Lost in Space. Well, I'll give it, one episode. And it was The Man Trap by George Clayton Johnson. And I thought, well, there was this one thing about it that really struck me, that there was imagination involved. And it was a very subtle thing, is if you look at the alien pyramid, the size of the blocks and the size of the doors was not human proportioned. And I thought, somebody there is thinking outside the limits of television, because based on what we'd seen in a lot of other shows, and so I said, there's something going on there. This could be a good science fiction show. Now, I was been reading science fiction since I was old enough to open a book, started with Robert A. Heinlein, Rocket Ship Galileo. So anything with rocket ships in it, I wanted. So I knew my science fiction. I'd already done 2 years at USC, so I wanted to. So I knew screenplay structure and format, and I submitted an outline for a 2-part episode called "Tomorrow Was Yesterday," and it was about a generation ship that gets lost, and the Enterprise rescues it, stumbles across it, and of course the people don't understand that there's anything outside their generation ship. Gino Kuhn, I wrote that, and my agent turned it in on Monday. So we had September 6th, the show premiered, or was September 8th, excuse me, show premiered, and that was a Thursday, and the following Monday. So I wrote this 60-page outline over the weekend. My agent turned it in on Monday. And I got a call before the week was over. We really like what your young man has written. We'd love to meet him. And that was Gene L. Kuhn. So I came in. He said, we're all bought up. And your episode, as outlined, would be too expensive. But we'd love to see what you can turn in if we're renewed for a second season. I said, okay, great. So the following February, we heard that Star Trek had been renewed. So immediately, I'd been dashing off outlines. I turned in 5 outlines, submitted 5 outlines. Now, the joke here, there's 2 jokes here. The first joke is I actually mentioned the Tribble episode in that first meeting with Gene L. Kuhn. I said, I have an idea for these fuzzy creatures. He says, sounds expensive. I don't think it'll work. So I said, all right, fine. And I wrote the outline anyway because I knew it wasn't. The other joke, I mean, I just didn't take no for an answer. I was just absolutely certain that the fuzzy little creatures was a story that had to be told. The other joke was that because we were doing Winnie the Pooh and taking it on tour for all of the fall semester, we had rehearsals and then we had the show. I think we had 6 weeks of touring. I mean, just a lot of work because we took it to all the different schools and high schools and grammar schools and, supermarket openings, whatever. And so I did not see any more episodes of Star Trek at all until I think I saw one around Christmas vacation. And then so that I was playing catch up in February, finally watching the show and finally seeing reruns. And I got a call in June that they were going to buy the Fuzzy story. Dorothy Fontana had written a memo. This one has some whimsy. I must have a copy of that memo somewhere. And Gene L. Kuhn called me and said, we're going to buy this. And we went step by step on that. But the joke was that I did not admit I'd seen at that point maybe 6 or 8 episodes. So I was watching every rerun, reading every script I could. We didn't have DVRs or VCRs or tapes or anything. So it was only if you could catch them on Thursday nights. So I would visit the set. I asked permission to visit the set, and I was reading scripts like mad and watching them shoot. And we went step by step. First, I wrote the outline. Then I got to do first draft. Then I got to do the rewrite. But the biggest part of the adventure was going to the set and watching everybody work and listening to how the actors spoke in real life. Because I don't think a lot of people understand this, but actors are human beings. And they have their quirks and idiosyncrasies. Bill Shatner is a really marvelous. He's a workaholic, and he has this pattern of speaking. And then Leonard Nimoy has also a very, I hate to use the word stentorian, but because that's the wrong word. He has this very methodical way, precise way of speaking that suits Spock perfectly. And all of the other actors had their own specific voice. So the more you listen to an actor as a person, and then the more you listen to the way they're playing their character, the more you listen to the line that you get the voice in your head. When you get the actor's voice in your head, then you can write dialogue that is from the character. And I think of all of the, I know a lot of people say, oh, Tribbles is very funny, or Tribbles is this, Tribbles is that. It's an ecology story too, which that was the lesson snuck in there. But of all of the real strengths of the Tribble script, I say that the strongest part was that I was able to capture the character, the voices of the actual characters, so that in the scene with Scotty, so who started the fight? That's Bob Justman wrote, I think, gave me one of the best compliments ever. He said that scene was probably the best scene in the entire season, demonstrating the relationship between Kirk and Scott. And that is really the kind of praise you want, is that you got the characters. Because of all the things necessary to do in a television show, if you get the characters right, the audience will believe the story. I mean, especially with Star Trek, when you do stories like Spock's Brain. So I think really the greatest, for me, it was on-the-job training in how to write Star Trek, which there's another point that needs to be made, that a lot of people have not really understood the context of what Star Trek was at the time. Television writing grew out of radio writing. Before television, there were these half-hour dramas on radio. sometimes an hour-long drama, but mostly half-hour. When television came along, most of the shows were half-hour shows. Dragnet was a half-hour drama. I'm trying to remember some of the others. Twilight Zone, Alfred Hitchcock. Most of the shows were half-hour shows. Two things happened in the 60s. One was color television finally got to a market penetration that it was profitable for the networks to go all color. So mid-60s, 65, 66, 1966, CBS, ABC, NBC said, we are the full color network. All our shows are in color. This would not only help sell color TVs, but also it would attract more viewers from those who had color TVs. But the other thing, which most people don't, and this explains why Star Trek's color palette was the way it was. Color TV in that time was, you could do primary colors very nicely, but there was no subtlety. Those sets were primitive by any standards. And so the directive was lots of bright colors, simple colors. And so if you look at Mission Impossible with that bright red screen at the beginning, look at the color palette. And Star Trek, we had these beautiful bright colored uniforms, and the walls were always colored with a blue or orange or purple light that Jerry Finnerman would sometimes pattern. So that was because of what we could do. We couldn't do subtle. You wouldn't try on those sets, and with that technology, you wouldn't try to do something as beautifully intricate as Firefly. It wouldn't read. It was too busy. And most of the shows of that time, the sets and costumes and colors were kept very simple. The other thing, and this is the part that's most people don't get, is that television had moved from a half-hour format to the hour format, which was the point I started out with. And the reason why is, let's say it cost you $100,000 to do a half-hour show. But if you stretch that show out to an hour, you already had the actors, you already had the sets, you paid a little more for the script, you paid for an extra 2 or 3 days of shooting, but you reduced the amount of overhead of having to shepherd an extra script through the process. Less sets to be built, less costumes to be, less actors to be hired. You could get that second half hour for 40%. So if you were spending $100,000 an hour for a half hour, you could spend $140,000. Actually, it was more than that. I'm just using those numbers because Star Trek was $178,000 an episode. But that's the point, was that was cheaper than 2 half-hour shows. The problem for screenwriters and producers and directors was that we were still inventing the hour format. The first 5 years of the 60s, nobody knew really how to do an hour show. And if you look at Twilight Zone and Alfred Hitchcock, when they went to the hour format, they didn't work as well. The episodes felt padded. So to do an hour show, you needed 35 scenes, 35 motivational units. And that is almost a B movie. It's almost a 70-minute movie in terms of storytelling. And what we've done since then is we've packed even more story into less time by accelerating the rate of storytelling. And by the way we tell the scenes is that we start midway through the scene and leave the scene before it's really over. Somebody says something profound, and instead of sticking around to see how the other character reacts, we cut to the next scene, which is not, to me, dramatically valid. It's very annoying because it's like going through a series of cliffhangers, but it works for television. But at the time, in the 60s, we were inventing not just Star Trek, we were inventing the television format of the hour show along with everybody else. And there weren't a lot of people who knew how to do this. Most of the people in the Writers Guild of America had come out of radio or movies. And television was still 10 years of infancy. It was 10 years is you're still learning how to walk. If you compare shows that were done in the 70s and the 80s with shows that were done in the 60s, you can already see the difference, the maturity of the format. And today, people who've grown up with television today look back at the original episodes of Star Trek, and sometimes they have trouble getting into them. They look too quaint. because those episodes, but I think those episodes have aged very, very well. I sit and I watch some of the old episodes. I get caught up in Kirk and Spock. They hold up because of the characters and because the storytelling from the really great writers. You had Harlan Ellison, Dorothy Fontana, Theodore Sturgeon, Jerome Bixby, Max Ehrlich, Jerry Saul, Richard Matheson, Robert Bloch, Norman Spinrad. You had so many, Sam Peoples, Stephen Condell. You had so many really good writers involved in the first season and coming back for the second season as well, that those stories hold up. The same way you can go back and watch the original Alfred Hitchcock Presents or Twilight Zone. They hold up because we didn't have a lot of special effects. We didn't have CGI. Everything was either practical or you didn't do it. And so, and this is my personal theory on storytelling, is drama is what happens in the space between two people. So if you lock two people in a room and let them start talking, you're going to have a hell of a story there. And in fact, I just did a 1-hour play. It's two guys on stage and do it without props, without costumes, without anything. And it is, while the two long monologues where they're sharing each other well together by a hell of an argument. And we got standing ovations for this play. It's called Uncle Daddy Will Not Be Invited. And it proved my point to me that two people connecting or failing to connect is true drama. And so in television in the 50s with Twilight Zone and Alfred Hitchcock and even coming to Star Trek, the drama had to be the relationships of the characters, not look at the giant robot knock down the city. The fact that we can now do all these great special effects doesn't mean we have to or even we should. Because ultimately, and I'll give you an example. The Transformers movies. Can anybody remember the plot, the actual story of any of the Transformers movies? No. Giant robots knocking things down, fighting with each other. Okay, yeah, all right. There's your. But if you, and you even have trouble remembering the plot of the Avengers, which I loved enormously. Joss Whedon knows how to tell a hell of a adventure story, but if you stop and think, can you remember the plot of City on the Edge of Forever? And here it is, 47 and 48 years later. Yeah, I can remember the plot of City on the Edge of Forever real clearly. I remember exact incidents. The beggar. I fought at Verdun. That's great stuff. You can remember these original stories because you remember the interactions of the people. Whereas if you get to special effects and you get too dependent on the special effects, story disappears.
Let me ask you a question. You mentioned, basically being, I don't want to say heralded, but heralded for nailing the relationship between Kirk and Scotty. We actually spent a lot of time when we were doing Trouble with Tribbles talking about the stuff that we learned about Scotty. When you were writing that, were you like, there's something between these two guys and I'm going to suss it out? Or is it more like, okay, there hasn't been much really stated between them, I'm going to define it? I mean, which one were you doing?
Actually, let me come at it from a different angle. By the time we got to the Tribbles script, I had read at least half of the second season and seen most of the first season. Not all of it, but enough of it. And I was getting bored with Kirk Spock. Now, I didn't say I didn't like him, but I was getting bored with every story was about Kirk and Spock, and I wanted to find out who else was on the ship. And so one of the things I decided early on in the Trouble with Tribbles script was every character in the ensemble would get something interesting to do. Everybody would get off the bridge and would have something interesting to do that would show us who they were as people. Now, with Scotty, in fact, with all of them, but there were two areas that I was benefited. The first is each of the actors spent a little time with me telling me about their characters. I'd visit the set and they'd say, "Who are you?" And I'd say, "I'm writing the Tribble script," and say, "Oh yeah, that looks like fun." And here's what I want you to know about my character. And Shatner was remember Captain Kirk is the captain. He's the star of the show, which is fair because they had just had this terrible column somebody had written in Saturday Review of Literature that Spock should be the star of the show because he was far more interesting than Kirk, which is absolutely wrong. Spock is interesting, but Kirk is the guy who has to make decisions, which is much more difficult than being right all the time. You can be right and make the wrong decision. Self-righteousness is a curse. I liked Kirk. I still do. I like the character very, very much. Because especially in those first 2 seasons, he had a humanity about him that he cared when a crew member died. You can see it in a lot of the scripts. I love that compassionate side of Kirk. But for Scotty, I went to the Writer's Director's Guide, the Bible. And the Bible says Mr. Scott would rather spend time with his technical journals than anything else. Now, at that time, as a technical journals, God, that sounds boring. But now, today, hand me a bunch of magazines about computers or stereo or cameras or that stuff. So I'm in hog heaven. I get it about technical journals now. But at the time, I thought, that is the most boring thing. What a nerdy thing. Yeah, and I was a nerd, too. So that was the source of the gag when Kirk says, you're confined to quarters. It was such an obvious line. Thank you, Cotton. That'll give me more time for my technical journals. And I don't do it as well as Jimmy do it, but I do my best. I used to do a real nice Scots accent, but I got out of the habit. And unless you practice your accents, they disappear. That was where it came from. It was in the Writer's Director's Guide, but a lot of other writers hadn't paid that much attention to the Writer's Director's Guide. So it was in there that Scotty would rather hang out with his technical journals. So that was, Scotty doesn't want to go on shore leave. He wants to stay and play with the machinery. And that's that's what excites him. That's his relaxation. He loves the starship. He loves the machinery. Once I got that little piece of character on Scotty, all the rest fell into place. That he's a lot like my son. My son likes taking cars apart and putting them back together again a whole new way. So Scotty is this marvelous engineer who loves engineering. And you don't use him any other way. When you pull him out of the lab and give him a love affair or anything else, you're destroying what's beautiful about the character. And on any spaceship, any starship, you're going to have the nerds aboard, the engineering nerds who just love their machinery and love making the starship work. And Scotty represents that.
I want to go back to a couple of things you brought up earlier. You mentioned the ecological message of Tribbles, and part of the inspiration I've read, obviously, being the rabbits in Australia. And actually, some of our listeners wrote back to us talking about other inspiration, the Heinlein story, the Rolling Stones, and then there was a much earlier Pigs as Pigs, from 1905.
And that all goes back to what I put in my book, The Trouble with Tribbles. I got the idea that Tribbles should look like fluff balls because Holly Sherman's Planet, had a keychain that had a fur ball on it. And I thought, if that was a living creature, it would be as cute as a bunny. You would love to play with it. And if it breeds like crazy, you got a problem. And, I had raised, during my teen years, if it lived or moved, I had raised it, frogs, lizards, dogs, cats, white mice, white rats, fish. What I think animals are the most interesting things on the planet because they reveal so much about who we are. And I knew with the white mice and the white rats, these are so cute. And they're just so lovely. But the damn things, they breed like crazy. And until I finally had to have 2 cages, one for the girls and one for the boys. And so finally I got rid of them all. You have that. That was part of my thinking is little, fuzzy creatures. And I had, did I have my dog then? Yeah, 1966. Yeah, I had a shaggy white dog and he was just this really nice, twin brother from another mother kind of. He was a very smart animal. And so I was this animal person, and the rabbits in Australia story had been haunting me for years, and here's the fluff ball. Now, later on, I was aware of Pigs of Pigs. I was aware of the Heinlein story, and Heinlein himself said to me more than once, it's not the idea, it's what you do with the idea. And he said, we both owe a debt to Ellis Parker Butler for Pigs is Pigs. And he even wrote that in a note to me. And he was very generous about that. I would tell you this, if Heinlein had felt, now the studio offered Heinlein a credit, and he said no, which was a very important lesson to learn. You don't jump other writers' credits. But if Heinlein had felt that I had done him wrong, he and I would never have been friends. As Heinlein had very strict boundaries. And we were very good friends. He'd call me from time to time. I'd call him. And he didn't give his phone number out to a lot of people. And we'd chat. He'd way off in Bonnie Doon. He didn't have a lot of human contact, which is partly the way he wanted to be left alone, but partly, he wanted to talk to his colleagues. He'd get on the phone with Theodore Sturgeon or with me or Diane Duane or other people. We'd give him a call from time to time. I dedicated a book and sent it to him. Expecting he'd put it on the shelf. No, 3 days later he called me and told me how much he liked the book. So really, I think people who are saying, oh, Gerrold took it from the Rolling Stones, even if that were true, it would not have been a problem because what I did with Tribbles was something different than what Heinlein did with Rolling Stones.
Now, for some of our listeners who don't know, obviously you are so intricately recognized and connected to the Trouble with Tribbles, but you were around Star Trek a lot, and you had a dynamic with the producers on the show. You were brought in to kind of doctor some of the other scripts later in the series. Yeah. Can you talk about two things? A, some of those scripts that stood out to you, some of the work that you did, and B, what your dynamic was like with the producers. You mentioned Gene Kuhn. We haven't really touched on Roddenberry.
Well, I'll tell you this. Roddenberry was out of town. He was on vacation with Majel, a well-deserved vacation, because if you look back at the history of getting Star Trek sold and getting it mounted and getting it produced and getting the first season and a half going, Bob Justman practically had a nervous breakdown. And Gene was exhausted because he's carrying the whole show. Anybody who's done any producing knows this. When producing, directing, show running, it is not a 9-to-5 job. It is a 12-hour job. It is a 16-hour job. You go home, you collapse, you go back. Your weekends disappear. It's backbreaking work. And even if you're only on staff, like I was on Next Gen, which is a whole other story, but it's a full-time job because you love the show, you want it to work. Here's this deadline rushing down on you. We have to have something to shoot. We have to be there on the soundstage. And my personal feeling is I want to give the actors the very best I can because they're going to take the blame. They're on the front line. So so Gene took a vacation. Gene L. Kuhn, as the showrunner, was pretty much running the show. He was the showrunner. He was pretty much in charge, picking actors, picking scripts, etc. And when Roddenberry got back, Trouble with Tribbles had already been shot. It was in the can. And I met him once. He says, nice script to me, and that was it. I met him once in the office, and wow, I met Gene Roddenberry finally. And very impressive, tall, big man, just and big, great smile, and you'd throw yourself on a hand grenade for him because you just wanted to make him happy. He had that kind of charisma. But privately, Gene would say things in private that he would never say in public. And I'm pretty sure he was very unhappy with the Tribble script because he said Star Trek is not a comedy. And I think that's partly the reason why Gene L. Kuhn was pushed off the show was because with Tribbles and A Piece of the Action and a couple other shows that were heavy on the comedy, Gene Roddenberry must have felt that Gene L. Kuhn was taking the show in a silly direction. The funny thing is that those lighter episodes are some of the most popular because they humanize the characters. With Tribbles, there had not been a comedy episode before, and I knew we were breaking the formula of the show. I knew we were going way outside, because normally we were saving the starship, saving a planet, saving the galaxy. And here, we're just trying to keep Kirk from getting up to here in Tribbles, and we don't even get to do that, And it's a very small show, but it humanizes the characters wonderfully, and it allows us to establish the Klingons as recurring villains. And the jokes worked. Now, this is an aside. Gene Roddenberry was not known for his sense of humor. So I love doing comedy. I think comedy is the best way to reveal the truth. And say things in comedy and they won't kill you for saying it. Gene, my experience of working with Gene is that he did not know how to tell a joke. He did know how to do a great rant. The kind of rant, oh, yeah, sign me up. He would do rants in the office about how angry he was about organized religion, or how angry he was about blah, blah, or angry, and it was great. He would do these great speeches. But jokes, no, not his best. So I think he was made uncomfortable by jokes because it was something he didn't understand. And the punchline on that for me, I think the thing that solidified it was, I think when he brought Fred Freiberger aboard for third season, I think somewhere in there he said Star Trek is not a comedy. Because Fred Freiberger's literally, I am not making this up, his very first words to me were, because I went in on a scheduled meeting, I screened Tribbles this morning. I didn't like it. Star Trek is not a comedy. Wow, I'm certainly in love with Fred Freiberger now. Wow, and I thought my social skills were crappy. The thing is I give Freiberger credit, much more credit than he ever realized. He could bring the show in under budget and on time. Where I find fault is I don't think he understood what Star Trek was really about.
Who were your biggest allies while you were working on the show?
Gene L. and Dorothy Fontana.
Yeah. And what do you make of, there's this image of Gene Roddenberry. There are two Gene Roddenberrys, and Rod has said this very often. There are the people who put him on a pedestal and say that he was a great bird and he could do no wrong. And then there are the people who say that Gene was the worst boss they ever worked for.
They're both wrong.
So what's the truth? What was your experience?
As a human being, Gene was marvelous. He wanted to be known as a visionary, and to some extent he was. He had a vision of a future that works for everyone with no one left out. It was a wonderful vision, inspiring vision. When he would talk to you, write that script that you've always wanted to write, and no one else will let you. You ended up being a better writer that you thought you were. Gene was inspiring, but he also would tell you what he thought you wanted to hear. Now, the other half of that is Gene, and he admitted this to me once. He said, sometimes if they ever figure, he says, I feel like I'm faking it, and I don't want, and one day the audience is going to find out. It's the imposter syndrome, which anybody who works hard on anything is really committed to anything. I've had that feeling. One day they'll think, I had somebody ask me about When Harley Was Won, my first novel. He says, how can you be such a good writer and so profound philosophically? I said, I'm faking the writing. Or I'm faking the philosophy. I don't remember why that.
Ken and I have that every time an episode of Mission Log comes out.
Well, we all have that feeling of faking it. Then the audience comes back and says, wow, this was great. I had all my misgivings about my play before it opened, and then we were getting standing ovations. And of course, the audience doesn't know what I wanted it to be. They only know what they saw, and what they saw worked for them. So, okay, great. Gene's big mistake between 66 and 86 was The Great Bird of the Galaxy. He began to believe the publicity. Because in 86, he would listen to writers much more than he would in 86. In 66, he said, let's hire science fiction writers. They know their stuff. In 86, he said, don't hire science fiction writers. They think they know our show better than we do. Well, it was the science fiction writers who defined Star Trek by the episodes they brought in. And by shutting out the science fiction writers, Gene is saying, we don't respect them anymore. By 86, he had believed his publicity. He had to be right about everything. So I had in my Blood and Fire script, I used the term wavicles, which I got from an Isaac Asimov column, his science column. And Gene bawled me out. Why are you making up scientific crap? Wavicles, what does that mean? And I said, well, it's a term for half wave, half particle. He says, if I pick up the phone and call my good friend Isaac Asimov, what will he say? I was really tempted to say, do it right now. I said, that's where the term came from. It came from an Isaac Asimov column, and Gene didn't hear me. And what happened on Next Gen, and this is a longer story, but what happened on Next Gen is Gene's health and concentration were both failing. And his lawyer came in and appointed himself chief of staff.
And that was Leonard Maislish.
Leonard Maislish, yeah. And who was the most disgusting, detestable human being I've ever met on the entire planet. You know, I was raised to only speak good of the dead. Leonard Maislish is dead. Good.
Let me ask you, do you think this was a conscious thing? Do you think this was a conscious good cop, bad cop relationship?
Yes, it was. Gene wanted to be loved by everybody, so he handed off all the dirty work to Maislish or other people. And I saw him do it more than once. I even saw him try to do it on me. He wanted me to love him, but then he would have someone else deliver the bad news. Well, by then, people were comparing notes, but what they had been told and what was really going on. So if you were the target of that kind of stuff, you ended up walking away saying Gene is the worst human being I've ever met on the planet. To have a complete view of him, Gene wanted to be loved. He wanted to be the person that the fans had made him up on the pedestal. So he couldn't allow himself to be the bad guy. So Maislish got to be the bad guy. And Maislish bragged he liked to hurt people. So there were times when Maislish was hurting people like Dorothy Fontana just for the sheer fact that he could. And what happened was that Gene ended up with no friends. Everybody left. I left, Dorothy left, Bob Justman left, and one day Gene is, I don't know if the person who reported this will tell the story, maybe he will. He says he saw Gene crying on his desk. What's the matter, Gene? All my friends have left me. Well, I don't have any friends anymore. What happened? Well, Leonard Maislish happened. Gene didn't trust me, and I had given him, I was giving him 16-hour days on the Next Gen. He didn't trust Dorothy Fontana, and she had given him 2.5 years on Star Trek and then was willing to come back. All of a sudden he's not trusting Bob Justman. They had a big fight about the stupidest thing is we needed a laser printer in the office. And Bob Justman wanted one in the production office because we're generating an enormous amount of paper. And Gene said, no, we can't afford a laser printer. It was $2,000. And they had a big fight over the fact that Bob Justman couldn't have a laser printer. Meanwhile, we're getting $2 million an episode.
Wow.
But Gene was getting an enormous amount of money per episode. I think it was like $25,000. No, not per episode, per week. So there's $100,000 a month out of every. There's a lot of money out of it, and plus the other producers are getting big salaries. And why were we hiring so many more producers than we need? Because if all you have is me and Dorothy, you're in good shape, really. Because who knows scripts better than me and Dorothy at the time. The other producers who were brought in had to be educated what Star Trek was. Leonard Maislish brought them in simply so as to dilute any authority Dorothy and I might have over the show.
And this instigated kind of a big exodus at the end of that first season of Next Gen.
Yes, it did. Yeah. Leonard Maislish was afraid, and to some extent Gene inherited this fear, that the studio was going to take Trek away from him again and give it to someone else. So what they did was make sure no one else would ever get enough authority or power. And one of the things, Bob Justman and I were generating hundreds of pages of memos per week. We need to worry about this. We need to take care of this. Let's address this. Here's a story idea, blah, blah, blah. And so the studio heads, I'd see them from time to time walking around on the lot or whatever, or in the commissary, and they'd come up to me and say, we love what you're doing. Keep it up. And then I'd get summoned into Gene's office and get bawled out. Because every time the studio heads would say to Gene, we love what David's doing, Gene would have to assert his authority over me. I didn't see the pattern at first. I was going, what the f*** am I doing wrong? And then I saw the second or third time it happened, I realized something weird is going on here. It was Leonard Maislish. And the result was not pretty.
You mentioned Gene's kind of grooming the image of the great bird.
Yeah.
Doing the lecture circuit, doing all of this stuff. Something that we try to do on Mission Log is we're always trying to parse the point where Star Trek, the piece of entertainment generated by writers who have good ideas, meets this idea of philosophy, social commentary, what's intended, what's not. You said that you came into Tribbles with the idea of doing comedy, but there was an ecological message.
Yeah.
In general, do you think that...
I don't think we got philosophical until after the show was off the air. I think we knew we were doing good ideas. We knew we were commenting on social issues. Drugs, Vietnam, anti-war, ecology is the Tribbles, mutual assured destruction against the Soviet Union, balance of terror, a private little war, a taste of Armageddon. Those were issue shows. And Star Trek was very good at doing issues. And Gene loved doing issue stories in the 60s because he was clicking on all cylinders then. By the 80s, he was not firing on all cylinders anymore. And while we wanted to do issues, Rick Berman wrote a marvelous memo, a 3-page memo. I just found a copy of it a few weeks ago, listing, I would say there must have been about 20 ideas on each page. He must have listed about 60 issues. Number 3 on the list was AIDS. And this was in the middle of the 80s when it was still, nobody wanted to talk about it. So here were all these issues that Rick Berman said we could address. So what happened between the 60s and the 80s was we went to the Star Trek conventions. And the two things happened at the Star Trek conventions. First, Gene Roddenberry became the great bird and started realizing, and at that time, he didn't have any other income. So Lincoln Enterprises was selling scripts and, tchotchkes of all kinds. And that was their income for a long time. So Gene wanted to push the sales, et cetera, which I don't blame him. And he ended up doing the I'm Gene Roddenberry, the great bird of the galaxy. No, he did, but he would do it in a very human, very almost humble way. I have this vision that we can do better. He's like, yeah, I'm inspired. Let's do that. So the fans bought into it, but then Gene bought into it. So I think that was part of it, is somewhere in there, Gene started seeing himself as a philosopher on the level of Gandhi or Gandhi is probably, I never saw myself as a philosopher. I loved reading some philosophers, but I see that philosophy in itself is a dead end unless you find a philosophy that you can apply that actually makes a difference for other people. Such as, Jesus was a great philosopher. Forget all the Bible stuff. He says, be kind to each other. Ooh, that's a great philosophy to live by. I like that one. And so philosophy by itself is, that's the guy sitting at the end of the at the counter in the diner with a cup of coffee telling you how the world works. Big deal. It's where do you make a difference for other people? And when Gene would talk about the vision, that was great, but it was, for me, it's always, how do you bring it home? How do you tell a story that brings it home? That's what I always wanted to do on Star Trek.
You said something very important about that Rick Berman memo. You said that one of those topics was AIDS.
Yeah.
And this has been an ongoing kind of fan discussion, fan debate, fan argument, and I know among the writers as well for the last 25 years, and that Star Trek's handling of LGBT issues. Where has the breakdown?
I can't talk about what happened in the office when I wasn't there.
Yeah.
You're going to have to ask Ron Moore.
Yeah.
Because he was there. Ron Moore said in a published article, and I don't remember where it was published, and I apologize for that because I really should have saved a copy. He said that it wasn't going to happen while Rick Berman and Brandon Braga were running the show. Gene made a promise in front of 3,000 fans at a convention in November of 1986, and I was there because I had been invited to the same convention. A fan named Franklin Hummel stood up, says, can we have LGBT characters in Star Trek? Gene said yes. And Gene said, it's time, we should do it. It was a very courageous thing for Gene to say, particularly in 1986, which was, the whole gay pride movement was only about 16 years old, and had, Gandhi says, first they ignore you, then they ridicule you, then they fight you, then you win. And the gay movement was still up to ridicule at that point. It was with maybe a little bit of fight because the gay people had established some political power with Harvey Milk in 1978 and defeated Proposition 6 here in California. But at that time, people were the mainstream was still very uncomfortable. The polls showed that it was like 60-70% people didn't want to deal with it. So for Gene to say, yeah, I think that was a really courageous, and I give him credit for it. And then in a meeting a few weeks later, he mentioned it again. Now, I figured, okay, he said it because the fans wanted to hear it, but I made a note anyway. Then I wish I'd had a portable recorder in those days. Then a few weeks later, in a meeting, Gene said it again. Bob Justman, me, Eddie Milkus, I forget who else was in the room. He says, we're going to have a gay character at some point. Bob Justman said, what, Lieutenant Tutti Frutti? And Gene bawled him out. He says, no, it's time, Bob, that we're about diversity. And I'll give you another one, which I think it just as a sidebar here. As we're working out the characters of the show, and we decided we have to have a disabled character, and Gene asked me to do a memo. What are the disabilities, and how would we deal with it? And I thought, well, we could have somebody who's got this kind of a prosthesis, that kind of prosthesis. I said, we could have somebody with Down syndrome who has a brain augment. That would be really neat because we have a lot of special needs. Gene came up with, how about we'll have him be blind? And we'll give him this eyepiece, and we'll do that with our chief engineer. I said, oh, great. It's like, because LeVar Burton has these beautiful expressive eyes, so we cover them up, right? And we had already decided, we were going to have LeVar. We didn't know it was going to be LeVar at the time, but we had already decided it was going to be our engineer would be black. And so we send that off, and we get a memo back from an executive at Paramount. Why are you giving him 2 disabilities? And we all just looked at each other and said, we're just speechless. What do you say to that? And Gene said, I'll handle it.
Wow.
Now, I give Gene credit. Yeah. He got it on a lot of things. I give him credit for that. He got it intellectually, but putting it into practice, because at one point I said, George Takei is one of our biggest people. Wouldn't it be great we could do something with have Captain Sulu or have Sulu? And Gene said, no, very firmly, absolutely not. Well, he knew George was gay. It was not a secret among those of us who worked on the show. But in practice, Gene could be a racist, a sexist, and a homophobe. Intellectually, he could give you the speech. He could talk the talk. But walking the walk, he hadn't connected the talk with the walk yet. It was very weird because you wanted to believe that somebody who could talk the talk was going to walk the walk. He got it sometimes. Sometimes he got it. Sometimes he didn't. He didn't mind if Mike Miner was gay or William Ware Tice was gay. I don't think he wanted the gay person in the audience. I don't think in the office or in a high profile position. You want it, second tier is okay. I wrote the Blood and Fire script, and half the people in the office got it, what I had done. And the other half went crazy. And unfortunately, Leonard Maizlish had such control over Gene. At the time, we didn't know it, but Leonard Maizlish was doing the script notes for Gene, and then Gene would review Maizlish's notes and just check them off. And my proof of this, I'm not just saying this casually, is I have a copy of Blood and Fire with Leonard Maizlish's notes on it, and the copy of Gene's copy of the script where he had checked off everything Leonard had written a more detailed note on. I have the evidence. So and the Writers Guild eventually sanctioned the show for what Leonard Maizlish was doing. So I'm not this guy who's making stories up or this disgruntled ex-employee. I'm this, I'm the whistleblower here on this one. And the studio, the Writers Guild sanctioned the studio, and the studio had to escort Leonard Maizlish off the lot. But by then the damage was so done, the show was crippled. We started October 20th was my start date. And I said to Gene, we have a 6 months head start. Everybody else does their buying and writing season. They start April and May. They get the renewals and they go to work for a June or July start date. Here we are, October. We've got a 6 month head start. We can have our entire season written and ready to go, and we know we can by May. And you know what happened with Leonard Maizlish's meddling and Gene's inability to control his own show, and all those extra producers who've been brought aboard? They did not have a final draft of Encounter at Farpoint on the first day of shooting. They were rewrite, and the entire season was a scramble to get a script to the soundstage on time. See, there's the dilemma: is you have this guy who's so inspiring as a visionary, and he's an incompetent manager, or he surrounded himself with people who are subverting him. The office politics were horrendous. And when Blood and Fire when I got all of this nonsense going on with Blood and Fire, I had to make a choice. Do I want to be a good writer, or do I want to be an accessory to the crime? And I say, if I leave the show, the fans are going to be, I'm going to take a hit with the fans. They're going to say, oh, how did David Gerrold screw it up? But if I leave the show, there's a lot of money I'm not going to make. It cost me millions of dollars. But if I leave the show, I retain my integrity as a storyteller, which I have to, I have so little integrity. I have to fight to protect everyone out of it. And when I walked away, I said, I'm going to do two things that I have been postponing too long. The first is I'm going to write the books I want to write that I have not had time to write. And, by effectively blacklisting me in the industry, they spread the word that I was too difficult to work with. And no producer would even return my calls. After a while, I couldn't even get an agent. And so they did me a favor. So for 10 years, 15 years, I wasn't doing any work in television. That was a big favor because I got to write some books that I was really passionate about. And I adopted the most wonderful little boy. And I got to spend a lot of time at home with my son. And we had a lot of fun together. He had a stay-at-home dad. I was there for him, which is what he needed more than anything. And we got to do a lot of traveling together, which we wouldn't have done if I'd have had And ultimately, I got to write The Martian Child, which won Hugo and Nebula and became a John Cusack movie. So, it was I didn't realize it at the time, but leaving Star Trek was a good thing for me because it was much better for me as a writer. There was a lot of human growth I got to do, and I got to understand things that I would not have understood philosophically, emotionally, experientially if I had stayed in that pressure cooker. We got to turn out a script. We got to turn out a script. We got to turn out a script. And the scripts that we were getting to see were getting progressively worse. And this is not just me creebling about. This is, you look at the fans' reaction to the first two seasons of Star Trek, Next Generation, there was an awful lot of resignation and disappointment from the fans. And that's because there was no central vision on the show. I'm not a big fan of some of the people who came aboard later on because here and there, but I give credit to the ones who made it work. Ron Moore did a great job. Renee Echeverria, that whole team that did DS9 and did that marvelous Trouble with Tribbles 30th anniversary, that was one of the best scripts I've ever seen. And while I didn't follow all the later shows very closely, I could see that they had created, ultimately, while it wasn't the Star Trek I wanted to do or the Star Trek I wanted to see, I saw that they were doing a pretty damn good job of making it work, what they had inherited from the first 2 years. And I have to give them credit for that, taking this damaged piece of goods, those first 2 years were damaged, and turning it into a show that had some real strengths to it later on. You got to give them credit for that.
Let's bring it back to what brought you into Star Trek in the first place. I mean, next to Spock and, I guess maybe the Klingons, Tribbles are like the most constant presence in each iteration of Star Trek, all the way through Star Trek Into Darkness.
Yeah, that was fun. Although they missed a gag in Into Darkness. McCoy should have come back to the sick bay and found it full of tribbles. That would have been a much better gag.
All right. Spoiler alert for anybody who hasn't seen it. Although if they're listening to this and they haven't, I don't know what they've been doing. I'm actually
haven't seen the movie yet. Screw them.
I'm actually very afraid of just incredibly strong tribbles in the next movie. Although that could certainly be the next movie. But why? Why do tribbles keep coming back, do you think?
Because they're cute. Look at the Pillsbury Doughboy keeps coming back. He's cute too. No, I think tribbles speak to an instinctive thing that we as human beings, we like to nurture cute little fuzzy animals, like pit bulls and pot-bellied pigs and dogs and cats. We have a relationship with animals. You look an animal in the eye and you're looking at another soul. Horses and cows and even sheep with their ugly eyes. You look into you look at an animal and here's this other living thing. And if you have any empathy at all, which I think empathy is the greatest of all human virtues, if you have any empathy at all, you start to wonder about this. Who's over there and what are they seeing and who do they see you as and what's the connection? And the gag is tribbles don't have eyes, but they purr. And if you've ever picked up a little kitten that has its eyes still closed and you have to feed it with a bottle, and while it's sucking away and then you're petting it and it starts purring and it connects with you on a very visceral level. And I think that's the thing is that tribbles are an emotional connection. They awaken you at that very human emotion that we have a heart, we have a soul, we have passion, we have emotion. And while Star Trek has invested so much time and energy in let's be logical, let's be really logical and recognize that human beings have emotions and that emotions are part of the package and they can be a very valuable part of the package. It's not just about feeling good or feeling bad, is your emotions are kind of like your instrument panel giving you a sense of the terrain you're on in relationship to other people. If you can get to a very Zen state, and this doesn't happen because you say, oh, gee, I'll have a very Zen state. It takes a little work. But if you get to a very Zen state of where you are actually looking at your own emotions as they occur, your emotions are like that needle on the dashboard telling you how fast you're going and how much fuel you have and what direction you're going. Your emotions are a clue to what's happening in the universe around you. I see, and here I am being the philosopher now. But that's one of the things is after leaving Trek, I got to do studies in applied philosophy and the human potential movement, which is a terrible name for it, and all kinds of workshops and trainings. And it's like, what is it I don't know that other people know that I want to know about? So I said once when I was still in college, I think I'm a perennial student. And now here it is like almost a half century later. And I say, yeah, I guess I am, because one of the things I love doing, people ask me, what do you do for a living? I say, well, 90% of what I do is research and the other 10% is planning revenge.
Is there any untapped ground? I mentioned the LGBT thing, but for Star Trek to look forward, what do you think the areas that Star Trek has not yet dealt with that are kind of crying out to be handled by
well, I would ask you, what makes you uncomfortable? Mm-hmm. Because in the 80s, talking about LGBT topics, most people didn't want to because, if I bring it up, people think I'm gay. And now we're at the point of who cares? George Takei came out. Probably, and more power to him. I love George. But the real courage for LGBT people was to come out in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s and be willing to be the target. Be willing to be on the front line. And I think that we need to acknowledge the courage of those who came out when it wasn't popular to do so. Now, if Tom Cruise came out of the closet tomorrow, we'd all go, well, thank God, Tom, we were afraid we were going to have to tell you. I don't know if he's gay or not. I don't care. I just saw this wonderful Steve Soderbergh picture behind the candelabra about Liberace, and it was a very sad picture because it's brilliantly produced and directed and acted, and the production values, as brilliant as the whole thing was, is really a story about the ultimate dysfunctional gay relationship because Liberace could not be honest with his public about who he was back then in the 80s. Today, if Liberace were alive and working today, it'd be like, yay, Liberace is, he could come out and people would cheer him for it. So I was very, I saw it differently. And now, what's next? I mean, assume we're now at the point where a majority of American people recognize that
now
gay rights are civil rights,
Nerdist.com.
lesbian rights, bisexual, transgender rights are civil rights, and that it's wrong to discriminate based on who someone loves or their sexual identity or orientation. A majority, but we still have a long way to go. I mean, we won the battle against racism with the Federal Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights. We still have a lot of rampant racism today all over the country, not just the South, not just, here, there. We still have racism. So we're still going to have sexism, misogyny, homophobia, all those things that that waste our time and have us be less than we are. But I would say if I were producing Star Trek and somebody said, well, what are the issues? Well, terrorism is the obvious, but let's take fear is the bigger issue, because every time we do something stupid, it's because we did it because we're afraid. I would say what makes us the most uncomfortable, and that would be where I would go, and I would have to look. Sex makes a lot of people uncomfortable. Violence makes people uncomfortable, but there's political issues that make people uncomfortable. The discordance between the haves and the have-nots in our country is the worst it's ever been. It's worse than it was just before the French Revolution. I wrote The Cloudminders, the original story, Castles in the Sky, was to address it, which was obvious to me even then. And I think that would be a story I would want to tell, economic disparity. So and the possibility of revolution that creates. Another story that I would tell is where's the positive in organized religion? Where's the negative in organized religion? That would make a lot of people uncomfortable. And one of the arguments I've heard against that kind of storytelling is it offends people. Well, David Kelly has been doing that and has one of the best careers in television. My response to that is you're not offending people. You're not doing the job that Star Trek is supposed to be doing. You're supposed to wake people up, make them think, make them care, have them talk about these things instead of pretend they're not existing. And so we got one of the memos on Blood and Fire, my gay episode, big gay episode, 2 gay characters, 1 line of dialogue. How long have you two been together? Since the Academy. That was it. That was the, and this was, and Rick Berman wrote a memo saying we're going to be on at 4:00 in some markets. We're going to get letters from mommies. And I said, great, it'll show they're watching. Then not only that, they'll watch the next week to see if we're going to offend them again. We want people talking about these issues. And besides, in this script, if you're under the age of 13, it's how long have you two been together? You're good. They're good friends. And if you're over 13, you'll get the subtext. This went down to Gene's office. Leonard Maislish and Gene probably spent 3 seconds on it. Leonard says, rewrite it to take the gay characters out. So Herb Wright sticks his head in my office later that day and says, great memo. Because in my memo it said, Gene made this promise. If not here, where? If not now, when? And Herb Wright says, great memo. You still have to rewrite the script. Okay. And that was the moment I said, I'm in the wrong place. Because if we're not going to do what we promised to do, if we're not going to keep our promise, and if we're not going to do stories that are real issue stories, why are we doing this at all? Why am I wasting my time doing something anybody else can do? I only get one life. There's only one person on the planet who can write a David Gerrold story. Some people like reading David Gerrold stories. Not enough. But I better be doing the stories that I love doing, and not the stories that I'll be embarrassed about or have to apologize for, or have somebody come up to me at a convention and say, why did you cop out on so-and-so? I'm not going to be the cop-out guy. I can't do it. One of my role models is Harlan Ellison. Another role model is Robert A. Heinlein. Once upon a time, Gene Roddenberry would have been in that list. Not again, not more. And it's. I love Gene. He gave us Star Trek, but he was not someone who could live up to his own promises.
For our listeners who want to read more David Gerrold stories, where should they find you?
Oh, go on Amazon, and you can download a Kindle app if you don't have a Kindle. And there is, I would recommend, if you want hard science fiction, there's Nowhere Man, Ganning It's a Spaceship. If you want passionate, there's 13 O'Clock and In the Quake Zone. Those are good for LGBT readers. If you want to, the play I just produced and directed is called Uncle Daddy Will Not Be Invited, and that script is also on Amazon. And there's a whole bunch of other works, but those are the ones. Oh, and if you want one that refers to Star Trek in a really fun way, read The Kennedy Enterprise. Those are, I think, some of my favorite ones up on Amazon.
And I'll just say that I'm wildly entertained by your Facebook page.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, you can follow me on Facebook. I can't friend you because I'm at my limit, but George Takei posts all this really funny stuff, and he's king of Facebook, and I love him. And Brad, they're just both wonderful. I can't be that funny all the time because I start getting angry. And my son, will come, he'll wake up one morning and he'll do an hour rant about he saw something on Facebook that was racist. I say, oh my God, somebody on the internet is wrong. and I'm old enough that I don't get angry. I get amused by the stupidity of racism or misogyny or homophobia. And at the same time, I get a little disturbed. It says, is there something I'm being unconscious to? Am I being stupid about something? So it's a constant learning experience. I think that if we don't go through life, so what can I learn today? We're wasting our time.
Thank you so much for doing this.
Oh, no, it's my pleasure. I'm not going to be doing a lot more interviews. It takes up too much time, and I'm not getting paid, and I'm not giving up my writing time anymore. But this one, I love Rod. I think Rod is a great guy, and this is a great project. So, the opportunity to be a part of it, of course I would.
Thank you.
Incoming transmission.
Hi, guys. This is Eric. I'm calling from Columbus, Ohio. And I'm just listening to the supplemental in my car, the one with Rod Roddenberry, where you're talking about the order that you're going to be doing the episodes in. I'm rather behind in podcast listening. Okay, so clearly to me, the order should be the original series, the animated series, the original 6 movies, straight into the next generation, and then the next generation movie starting with Generations. However, there could be an argument made for starting with Deep Space Nine halfway through the next generation and alternating episodes between Deep Space Nine and the next generation as they were on simultaneously, and Deep Space Nine was introduced through the next generation. If you remember, I believe Picard and the Enterprise kind of guest starred in the first episode of Deep Space Nine. I'd have to go back and watch it again to be sure. It's been a long time. So an argument could be made that at that point, when you hit the next generation and the Deep Space Nine being on simultaneously, you might want to alternate back and forth between those episodes, just due to the fact that they are happening concurrently. So that's my observation. Thanks for the show. Really love it. Bye.
Yeah, what's really interesting? It seemed like such a natural when we were originally talking about recording this. I mean, like before, like in March, I guess, of 2012, when we first started talking about doing this. We had it laid out. Yeah, it's going to be the original series, then the animated series, then the next generation. Oh, they throw the movies in there in between, of course. Then the next generation, then Deep Space Nine, then Voyager, then Enterprise, because doesn't that make sense?
Right.
And it does until you think about it.
Right.
And then all of a sudden you're like, I'm going to start Deep Space Nine, and Cisco's still going to be whining about the fact that, Picard was Locutus. That was years ago.
Right. Right.
Except, of course, it wasn't, because we pick up with Cisco being a little hinky with Picard because didn't his wife die because the Borg and all that? It's been years since I've seen it, and it'll be years until we get to it. But bottom line, a number of people have said, actually, sometimes these shows intersect. Sometimes they intertwine, and sometimes even if you don't have, stars from one series on the other series, you will have them mention something that happened on the other series. The only thing that makes sense is to watch them all.
Yeah, well, and here's the thing. Like, I think that wisely, the powers that be in charge of Star Trek looked at this and they figured, okay, well, we want the crossover audience, and we want to leave these little Easter eggs for them to find, and these mentions that kind of make the Star Trek universe very consistent if you're paying attention. But at the same time, they had to realize, well, okay, there are TNG fans that didn't necessarily pick up with DS9.
Yep.
There are DS9 fans that didn't continue with Voyager. So these series kind of work on their own, even if you didn't watch the others at the same time. So certainly there are things to be found, and there are rewards for that. But there's also something to be said for our sanity and the sanity of our listeners, that you can pick up the Blu-ray set, watch it in order, and not switch out discs every week because you're trying to catch up with the other series.
Yeah, God bless Netflix. That's what I'm saying. I mean,
right.
I hope they're still doing that many years down the road. I hope they still have the rights to Star Trek, because yeah, that whole switching out discs and all that dumb stuff. I just like the fact, I'll just hop over to the other series now and do that. I will say, though, if you are one of the people who loves The Next Generation and hates Deep Space Nine, and we have gotten emails from those people, and vice versa, people who love Deep Space Nine but had no use for Next Gen, you're going to need the slide rule to figure out when to listen. Because, like, okay, so last Thursday was Voyager, so what am I listening to now? I don't even know anymore. I don't guess.
Yeah.
I can't remember, though. Was there ever a time when all three of those series ever on at once, or has it always been two?
There were not. There was always an overlap at the end of one season, the beginning of the next show. So there were never three on the air at the same time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Because that might make me lose my head.
Yeah. But, I mean, I think long and short of it, we are still discussing this. We're still trying to figure it out. And very helpfully, we've gotten lists from you guys, from our listeners, saying, well, here it all is all broken down on this handy Excel spreadsheet, in case you want to do that. Which is great. I thank you for doing that. But we're still kicking around trying to figure out what would make the most sense from a production point of view for us, and just for a listening point of view for our audience.
Oh,
so
my
we'll see.
goodness, because the other problem, forgive me. Well, when the Enterprise goes back in time to, early 1900s San Francisco, that's a 2-part episode.
Yeah.
And there's no crossover, I don't believe, with anything going on Deep Space Nine at that point.
Yeah.
Because maybe Deep Space Nine wasn't even on the air. But what do you do about 2-part episodes that don't have anything to do with the other one?
Yeah.
Do you then, do you, or do you do both of those as one episode? Do you break it up the phone? I don't know if I want to do this show, John.
You see what we do, the stuff that we struggle with.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. It's terribly difficult to be a couple of geeks who sit around talking about Star Trek.
Hi, this is Chris Powers from Quincy, Illinois. John and Ken, I want to tell you that I always enjoy the Mission Log podcast. But I want you to know that I think the bashing of the sexism is getting old hat. The reason I say that is because this is a 60s show we're talking about. And sexual mores, whether they were good for women or not, and they weren't, they were what they were. It's like criticizing colonial era people for wearing tri-corner hats. Not the same as certain people wearing tri-corner hats today. So what was in style back then, it is what it is. I should also say that the great bird of the galaxy, Gene Roddenberry, was sort of known for having, let's say, a wide-ranging sexual interest in women in general. He was very much an appreciator of the female form, let's say. So that has to be taken into account. That very much derives, I think, from the sensibility of its creator, as well as the time of that it was produced in. So, once again, thank you so much for producing this. Thanks to Rod for producing this, and good luck, and look forward to future episodes. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, first of all, Chris, thank you. And I'm going to start this with a sincere thank you for your comment and for being respectful about your comment and for your listening, because I really do love the fact that you called in and expressed your boredom, let's say, with the sexism thing that we address from time to time. Almost every time, I will grant you. I appreciate the way you said that, because there was somebody... and they may be listening today, and hi, I'm glad you're listening too, but there was somebody who got fairly snarky on Twitter this week and said, learning the lesson to press fast forward when Ken brings up sexism. So Chris, the way you did it, gold star, man. Thank you very much. That said, there are a couple of things. From the tone of your voice and from your name, I'm assuming that you have male parts. I can tell you that when I watch an episode of Star Trek with my fiance, who has lady parts, and it's a particularly sexist episode, she can't watch the episode anymore. And it's not like, I mean, she gets stuck on the sexism part. I kind of feel like it's important to go ahead and address that. And even though it does happen a lot, and even though you're right, it's a product of 60s culture in a lot of ways, I think it's important to acknowledge it and to talk it through, because there are going to be a lot of people who are going to be completely turned off by the fact that happens, to the point that they can't see any other value in the show. And I also think it's important to, even though it happens quite a bit, I personally think it's important to point out when it does happen, so that we don't, fall into the trap of, well, that was then, so who cares? Because somehow that kind of thing tends to leach forward. Now, what I will say is, and not to be too much of a challenge to you, would you say the same thing about racism? I mean, would we go ahead and keep watching Star Trek today if they had a Sambo character on there, or if George Takei had played Sulu the way Mickey Rooney played the upstairs neighbor in Breakfast at Tiffany's? You
just made me cringe physically by mentioning Mickey
both of
Rooney
those things. I'm sorry, because I said two things there that are horribly offensive.
Yeah.
But I mean, we don't take. Especially, and I don't know your ethnicity. I will say, for years as a white male, cries of sexism were pretty much like cries of an ant to my ears. I mean, they didn't ring with me, because it felt like, oh, come on, things are so much. You've come a long way, baby. So why are you whining? Well, no, these are actually real issues. Now, let me sum this up again with saying, thank you very much, Chris, for stating your position as eloquently and as genteelly as you did, and I hope that I've responded in kind. I don't go looking for the sexist stuff. It just, when it pops up, though, I feel like we have to go ahead and acknowledge it. The good news is we're over halfway through the original series now, so not likely to happen quite as much. In the next generation.
It'll never be sexist again. End of show.
The end.
The end. No, we've done a lot of episodes, and we have a lot more to go in all of Star Trek. And part of the thing that he's mentioning here is the sort of the repetition of we point out the same things. It's funny, in another voicemail, somebody said they really miss calling out Enforcer Spock. That was kind of a little meme that we had going for a little while, and they say, right. Oh, I really miss it. You don't have that anymore. And I feel like what's important about the sexism angle here is that we do, and by we, I mean you and I, but I also mean Star Trek fans, we give a lot of credit to Star Trek where it is very much due for thinking forward, for having a multiracial cast, for presenting ideas of peace and social progression, all from a time when it seemed like these things would never happen. And certainly here in the early 21st century, we have our own struggles. So it's important in this process to help contextualize Star Trek for a 21st century audience that we look at the places where it got it right and got it wrong. Yeah. So yeah, could we call it out one week and just say, yeah, and that happened and that's sexist and move on? Sure. Sometimes it may spark a bigger discussion, particularly when you are presented with a character who is female and who is strong and powerful. And I have to mention Ariel Shaw from Court Martial, because we actually got an email. I don't know if you got this one, Ken, or if it just came directly to me, where one of our listeners actually quoted our conversation. They transcribed our conversation talking about Ariel Shaw and how we kept mentioning she's this great, strong female character in a show where you've not seen a lot of that, and she's mature and she's smart. But then you and I are also kind of juvenile because we also keep saying how hot she is.
You see, that's the thing. I don't know. And there was another one that was kind of like that too. I don't think I got that email, and I would be curious to read our words, written back to us. It's kind of interesting. But Chris actually mentioned the fact that Gene Roddenberry kind of liked the ladies. Well, I kind of like the ladies. I don't think it's sexist to say that someone is attractive. I feel like in a lot of ways, cries of sexism or complaints of sexism might have gone a little far sometimes. And again, this is, I'm a guy with guy parts. So I have not been a woman on the receiving end of that. So I don't know for certain. It doesn't feel to me to say, oh, the woman who played Ariel Shaw is very attractive. Or even if we got a little goofy about it, because, I was a 13-year-old boy at one time and he's still there. I've got a Darth Vader mask over in that part of my studio. And I've got like 2 Star Trek patches against felt behind glass in another part of my studio. There's a 13-year-old boy living here. He also happens to be 40-something.
Right.
And doing this show. So, I mean, I don't think there's anything sexist about saying that someone is attractive. I think it's, how you then, treat that person. And yeah, I mean, we have, Ariel Shaw was a strong character. Dr. Dana was a strong character who was also attractive. We talked about her. Uhura. I mean, so often what we pay attention to about Uhura is the fact that Nichelle Nichols was black and being put in all of these situations. She's also a woman being put in all of these situations, and that is not a small thing. And certainly we applauded them for Majel Barrett being number 2 in the original series, although of course, or the original pilot, but of course that was shot down by the network because nobody's going to buy a woman in a position of power.
Right.
Yeah. So yeah. Anyway. Yes.
Yeah, I really appreciated Chris's call too, and it's not to say that our discussion or bashing of the sexism is going to end. It's not, and I certainly can't say that we won't call it out when you or I think someone is very attractive. That may happen again too. Yeah. But we're trying to do a couple of different things. We're trying to be real with you, our audience. This is where Ken and John are coming from. But we're also trying to look at this as what are the important issues, and are there messages unintended that are coming out of a show because they just got something wrong, and that has happened. There's so many things that Star Trek gets right, and we really like to applaud them for it. But every now and then that sexist attitude comes through. It's unfortunate, but I think it's worth discussing. But we'll try not to bore you too much with it, Chris. And thank you very much for calling, and thank you very much for listening.
Hi, Ken and John. This is Tom, living in Stockbridge, Georgia. You guys have definitely made Mission Log my favorite podcast that I consume. Just listen to your Trouble with Tribbles episode. I'm on board with your comments. There's one additional message that it's possible that it might actually tell you more about me than it does about the episode. But in short, what occurred to me was the idea that if only one Tribble, how much harm can it cause? Well, at the point that you've got a bunch of them, then it's an issue. For me as a collector, I get that with respect to, oh, it's just a Hot Wheels car. Oh, it's just an action figure. Oh, it's just this toy. But at the point that you've been doing this since 1975, and you might end up having boxes all up in storage and in your wife's second bedroom and, in the media room and in the garage, then, might actually take some management. So at the point that Kirk says, in answer to Uhura is saying, well, Jones says that the Tribbles give love and all that kind of stuff. Kirk's response is, well, too much of anything, even love, isn't necessarily a good thing. So I definitely thought that one of the takeaways from this, one of the messages, one of the You See Timmy moments would be there's something to be said for moderation. It is possible to have too much of a good thing. So there you go. You guys are most awesome. I look forward to Thursdays incredibly. I'll put the news broadcast and other podcasts to the back of the list and listen to you guys first thing on Thursdays. So take care. Best of luck to you guys, and thanks to Rod for tasking you guys and giving you your resources for being able to do this. It is so very appreciated. Take care. Bye.
Johnny's right. It's like me and heroin. I'm sorry. Was that wrong? And follow-up question, was that out loud? And it was also not, of course, that's not true. Not true. You probably had something much more serious to say about it than my stupid little one line.
Not now. No.
Good night, folks.
Good night. No, I like that. Well, first of all, I like that Tom got his own You See Timmy moment from that. And I think I mentioned in that show about how my girlfriend's brother got the pet gerbil or pet hamster and then couldn't take care of it anymore after it did its natural bodily functions. He was like, oh, it's cute, I'm going to take it home. And then he's done with it after about an hour. You know, so there's sort of a real consequence to the things that you buy and certainly the things that you collect. I mean, you mentioned moments ago about your Darth Vader mask and the patches behind glass. And, here I am living across the country from the house that I grew up in. And that house still has a room full of stuff, Star Trek stuff, Star Wars stuff, James Bond stuff, comics, all this stuff that I collected that I think is super cool, but I don't have anywhere to put it right now, Yeah. So imagine if it had been Tribbles and they could just multiply on their own. That would have been a mess. It would have been a lot to clean up. It's also interesting that in Tom's comment, he points out that Kirk says too much of a good thing, even love. Is not good. Yeah. Surprise, surprise. James T. Kirk, not wanting to stick around someplace where people like him. Right. Yeah. Right. No, this is not nearly difficult enough. Which is kind of funny. Did we mention that? I don't think we did mention that actually on the Trouble with Tribbles, but yeah. Anyway, that's just kind of an amusing thing. But yeah, no, I love the fact that he got his own You See Timmy and not one that we got. Yeah. Out of that. That's kind of fun. That's very cool. We get fantastic voicemail, fantastic email from all of you. I apologize that we cannot answer every single bit of it. Some of these can, Some of these, they'll do a several-page long dissertation on what you and I say about it. Oh, don't I know. Although somebody sent us a fascinating... I was embarrassed by the time we got to the end of the email saying that we're like... that by doing this and by being associated with Rod, we're actually becoming like part of this goes on the shelf now with the episodes. Yeah. Which is certainly more than I could have ever, more than I could have expected. Maybe in some weird, like sleep, like I'm on like between waking and sleeping. It might have been a dream that people would look at this show that way. But I mean, the fact that anybody does, and certainly the gentleman who wrote the email that is unfortunately not in front of me, felt that way was kind of stunning. Yeah. So yes, we've done a lot of the phone call or Skype call actually responses this time, but there are a number of ways to get in touch with us, and we would love for you to. And next time we'll hit emails instead of, I shouldn't say just, but we'll hit some emails instead of just the call-in. Number of ways for people to get in touch with us. Facebook, Skype, and Twitter at the handle Mission Log Pod, as we mentioned earlier. Also, Facebook and Twitter especially. That's how to keep up with us in Vegas. Mission Log Pod is the name there.
You can call us, although that's not an actual phone and it doesn't ring anywhere, so that's not going to get us in Vegas. 323-522-5641. The number again, 323-522-5641. You can email us, missionlog@roddenberry.com. Missionlog@roddenberry.com is the email address. And don't forget to check out our very nice home on the internet, missionlogpodcast.com. Remember, we may use your upcoming episode, huh? No, we may use your comments on an upcoming episode of Mission Log, a lot like this one.
Hi, John, Ken. This is Spock from Connecticut. I'm just calling to share with you my appreciation of this little adventure that you're on, and also to congratulate you on a fantastic podcast. I'm very much appreciative of what Mission Log has done for me, and that's assisting me in overcoming my fear. And that fear is shattering my idol that somehow the original series could not possibly live up to my memory of it, of the boy in the 70s, wide-eyed wonder of the future, and young man of the 80s, in discussions with my father and friends on themes and what this show means, and having lost touch with that as you move on to other things and other trek. I just was so afraid of repeating the absolute disaster of introducing my son to the Hardy Boys mysteries that the original series has been on the shelf for me for a long time. And I have to say, with the perspective and the and the approach that you have to show of taking the content seriously but never taking yourself so is wonderful, has been great, and it's been great to get back into this timeless, thought-provoking, and still forward-looking show. And again, I can't say enough how appreciative I am of the approach that you're taking to it. Gentlemen, live long and prosper, and I look forward to the next and the next and the next.